So as Ben mentioned, my name's Andrew Spencer. I'm the CEO of Australian Pork Limited. I'm going to talk to you about Australian Pork Limited as a company a little bit, and then I'm going to talk to you about the Australian pork industry. And as Ben mentioned, I had quite a specific brief, and I'm not going to completely stick to it because I'm aware that some people, I can see Khan here, were at the Outlook conference this week, might have been sitting in a session where I gave a presentation. I don't want to repeat myself, so hopefully it's a little bit different and we'll have a few different interesting things in it. So as I mentioned, I want to talk a bit about Australian Pork Limited, the company, because if you want to understand how the pork industry works and how it's been able to do some special things, you need to understand how APL works. And APL is quite a unique beast in the world of agricultural bodies. For a start, we're one of the 15 research and development corporations, the RDCs, who invest in research and development with the help of levies collected from our farmers and also with government matching contributions. Many of the RDCs are now structured as companies limited by guarantee, and APL is no exception. Another example would be Meat and Livestock Australia. So they're called industry-owned corporations, or IOCs, and many of those IOCs actually collect a marketing levy and undertake marketing on behalf, or generic marketing on behalf of their industries as well. So that's marketing for their commodities, not marketing for particular private brands. So marketing and R&D, that's where the responsibilities for the RDCs end, unless you happen to be APL. APL is also the representative body for pig farmers, and that means that we additionally operate in a totally different world to the rest of the RDCs, and that's the world of ag representation. In Australian agriculture, representative bodies and RDCs are traditionally separated for each agricultural sector. In fact, in many cases, they're quite antagonistic towards each other. And the RDCs have their guaranteed funding through their compulsory levies, and that's a fact which many of the representative bodies may be quite jealous of. So whilst MLA is the RDC for beef and lamb industries, the respective cattle and sheep meats councils are the representative bodies, totally different entities. In grain, they've actually got two representative bodies. So there's one called grain producers and there's one called grain growers. And that sounds a bit to me like the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front. And it's a bit like that in terms of how they get on together. But as I mentioned, the great thing about APL is that we are actually a one-stop shop for all of our industry's services, including representation. And in these days, in the 21st century, almost every significant issue that crosses my desk requires a response or to be addressed in terms of a research element or a consumer engagement element, a marketing element, or a regulator/government policy element. So that sort of a structure really allows us to take that broad approach in addressing the issues in the best possible way. Not everyone has been supportive of our model, despite its seeming success in serving our own industry. And the former Agriculture Minister, the Honourable Tony Burke, for example, he believed that bodies that receive compulsory levies should not be involved in advocacy. And the logic is that producers have no choice but to give us their cash, and they don't necessarily agree with the positions that we are putting forward on their behalf. Additionally, he believed that bodies receiving government funding should not in turn be lobbying government. And when you look at these points, both have, from a totally purist sense, some actual merit. But there's a couple of conditions on how APL operates that means that they're not really an issue for our function. The first is that, like all RDCs, we are not allowed to act in an agri-political way, and that's stipulated in our funding agreement with the government. So what does that mean? No one really knows, but our interpretation is that it means we're not allowed to have public preferences in terms of political parties or politicians, but we are definitely allowed to have preferences in terms of policies, and we do. And in the 21st century, considering how to get the most out of a government relationship, we are quite happy to retain rational discussions with government underpinning our policy positions without table thumping, waving banners, all the other things that you might do if you're agri-political. The second condition is that we have to quarantine the government part of our funding away from any kind of advocacy activity. And our government money is only to be used for research and development purposes, and it is. Sometimes the R&D funding is, however, used for policy research, and that's typically the type of work that fuels policy development, and policy development ultimately is the fuel for advocacy. But it's not, policy research is not advocacy. They're very different things. They're in the same chain of events. The Agriculture Minister that followed Tony Burke, the Honourable Joe Ludwig, was a great supporter of the APL model. And he had to steer his way through the Indonesian live export controversy and work with the cattle industry, and he told us all the stories about that. So he had to try and work with the Cattle Council, MLA, the Australian Beef Association, the Australian Live Exporters Council, Live Corps. I've probably missed some. But there were multiple different bodies, and when we would go and meet him, he used to say things to us like, paraphrasing, I love dealing with the pork industry because when you guys walk into my office, I know exactly who you are representing. Joe Ludwig, I believe, actually offered the APL model to other industries, other ag industries, to take on with government support through a transition. And as I also understand it, there were no takers. And you might surmise as to why that would be the case. But most of those bodies really were attracted by getting access to compulsory levies and therefore secure funding. But the idea of merging into one entity meant that too many people might lose their position. Now that's a little bit of my cynicism and opinion coming into that, but there were absolutely no takers on that offer. So anyway, as a result of the dual mandate that APL has, we live in two very different worlds. The world of the RDCs, and that's some cashed up entities generally doing some great work in research and development on behalf of their industries, governed by professional boards, and the world of the representative bodies. Someone told me once that there are some 300 different representative bodies purporting to represent one sector or another, or one segment or another, of Australian agricultural industries. So, in my mind, agricultural representation in this country is a bit of a dog's breakfast, and there's a number of reasons for this. And you might want to refer them as the Spencer theories on agricultural representation. There's a couple of them. The first one is that there are too many Australian farmers who are far too isolated. They spend too much time sitting in tractors driving around and around a paddock, and they're just thinking. And if you think about what it is that makes a farmer successful, they need to be resilient, they need to actually be quite stubborn, they need to be able to get through all the hardships that farming in Australia brings to them. And stubbornness and resilience are great attributes for Australian farmers. But when they sit in a paddock and they get opinions and they use that time to solve all of the problems in their world, and you multiply that by the thousands of farmers sitting in tractors, you end up with far too many different opinions about what the right thing is for agriculture. Some of these farmers then go on and get involved in agri-politics or become agri-politicians. And when they do, they can't stand back from strategy. They get too involved in tactics, they get too involved in management, and chaos reigns. A few years ago, we at APL joined the National Farmers Federation because we're a representative body. The government allowed us to do that. Those few years has actually been quite an awakening to us about how good we've got it in our industry. I actually have a lot of time for the NFF. I think they've had some great leaders and they do a great job with what is pretty meagre resources that they end up with. They've been led by some very impressive personalities. The problem with the NFF is their members, and it's not all of their members, but it's too many of them. And this is where my second theory comes in, which has been heard uttered many times in Canberra. And that theory is that too many Australian farmer representative bodies act in a way that is analogous to trying to win a game of rugby with 15 fullbacks. These councils and boards are stacked full of passionate farmers, and some of them are quite talented people, but they completely miss the point around talent diversity that is required in fully and properly representing their industries. So where are the legal experts? Where are the marketing experts, the corporate governance experts, the legal experts or financial experts? Where are the experts in actually participating in the food industry? And importantly, where is the business discipline around what they're doing? So in my opinion, the result of the dysfunction of agricultural representation is that Australian agriculture is awful at unity, and it's awful at supporting a common purpose, and that's a real shame because that costs the greater Australian agriculture every single day, and we're being divided and conquered by people like animal activists, radical environmentalists, and even sometimes politicians trying to appease minor parties. So it brings me back to the pork industry in the APL model. And to be clear, the pork industry suffers just as much as every other industry by the lack of a functioning, really umbrella, representative, strong organisation for Australia. But within our own sector, I believe that it actually works quite well, and there's a number of reasons why I think that. The first one is that we have resources, and through our resources we can do policy research and policy development well. Advocacy doesn't actually cost much. It doesn't cost much to put a backside on a seat in a politician's office in Canberra or a regulator and have a chat about what it is that your position is and why. That doesn't cost too much. What does cost a lot is coming to that actual position, because if you do it well, you go through a research, development and then the advocacy stage. It's what a lot of people refer to as making the bullets and then firing them. So we have the resources to do that, and that is led through our policy research. The second reason is that our model of everything under one roof, a total services type body, means that we can truly judge where to direct and prioritise resources in the interests of the industry with everything on the table. So the separation of research and representation for other sectors has meant, in my opinion, that this has not worked as well for them. Thirdly, our constitution dictates that we have to have a skills-based board, and only half of them are allowed to be made up of these passionate and skin-in-the-game pig farmers. The other half are experts in their fields. So we've got food industry experts, marketing experts, corporate governance experts, etc. And the quality of the individuals on our board and their collective talent is one of the main reasons that I joined APL, and it's one of the main reasons why I'm still here 10 years later. Fourthly, our constitution dictates that we have what's called a delegate system. Delegate system is where all of our members receive a voting right proportional to the amount of levy they pay. They use that voting right to elect a delegate. We pull all of those delegates together twice a year, put them in one room. We end up with 35 people in a room who represent 90% of all of the production of our industry. And those people can make decisions on behalf of industry in real time, and we actually do that. And that gives us enormous power. Pig farmers are first and foremost businessmen. In the majority of cases, they're not pig farmers because their father was a pig farmer or their grandfather was a pig farmer. There's not much romance about our industry. Unlike a lot of other agricultural sectors where sometimes I think they're held back by their traditions and their cultural affiliations.